my primary thing that I'm doing is loving the guys that have names that that I can give hugs where I am. There's a line at the end of Candide, Voltaire. He just says, "We must cultivate our garden," and that's how I kind of view pastoring and working in ministry is taking care of the people who are there.
Hello and welcome to What Would Jesus Tech? My name's Andrew Noble. It is just me today. Austin and Joel couldn't make it, in part because I kind of didn't want them to make it. I wanted all of my questions to be asked because I've been learning from Matthew LaPine for a few years now. I have his book, The Logic of the Body. Where is it? It's right here. By Lexham Press. It was a book that was on sale for only $2.99 American on christianbook.com. And I had just heard a podcast on Mere Fidelity about it. And I was like, what a deal. I got it. I remember reading it on vacation during the pandemic. And I just was like geeking out and telling my wife about how good this book is. And so I'm glad to finally have a conversation with Matthew. Kind of reached out before the summer and schedules couldn't work. And so now here we are. And we were talking before I hit record and trying to get some advice because I'm navigating this PhD world. I'm right at the beginning. And Matthew has finished off his dissertation. He wrote this book that has won an award through Christianity Today. And it's a very helpful book on anxiety, on neuroplasticity, on what it means to be human a little bit and understanding how to resolve our emotions with our minds. And so we'll get into a little bit of that today because I do want you to learn from it, but I also want to learn as well. We're all learning here. So Matthew, thanks for joining us on this podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's great to meet you, Andrew.
What was your, rewind back before you started your dissertation? Why did you go into it? What was your goal? Was it to write this book that you wrote?
No, actually, no. Just to kind of give a little bit of background, I had we'd had a family situation, just kind of trying to work through mental health issues where, what I was learning in seminary and what was working, in trying to work through that seemed to be at odds with each other. So that's 15 plus years before I ever got to PhD work. But that kind of planted a seed of a tension in me. And so basically at that point in time, I was going to seminary because I wanted to be sure I was going to be a Christian at 35. And so I was dealing with, I attended DTS, but I studied my degree is systematic theology. I studied entirely philosophy, just trying to figure out apologetics and what it means to know something. I'm actually talking with Esther Meek today. I'm excited about that just after this call because she was a huge help in my life, just helping direct me to Michael Polanyi. And anyway, all that to say, I sort of set the concerns about mental health aside for a long time and thought that I was going toward something philosophical, maybe an epistemology or aesthetics. And so I even applied to aesthetic programs in philosophy that had a focus on aesthetics, theology, and the arts. But what ended up happening was I took the proposal that I was submitting to these programs and I sent it to TEDS because I love Kevin Van Hooser. And so sometimes I say that I think that he's like 1/3 of my brain because he's a creative conservative. He in the sense that he's defending historic Christian orthodoxy and Protestantism, but in a way that is integrative and makes connections between a lot of different things. And so I was impressed by that, wanted to study with him, and I ended up getting a full ride. So I was like, well, I'm going to go there then. When someone pays you to go to school, that you do that. But the proposal that I initially entered with ended up being nothing like what I wrote. And part of the reason was I realized that I was wanting to talk about formation. I was wanting to talk about the Bible as literature, especially probably narrative or poetry, and sort of the formative power of the genres of scripture and all this. But then I realized I don't actually know what I mean by formation, and why do I think emotions are a big part of this? But then how does this fit with my experience with mental health stuff? And so I was essentially like, well, first I got to work on the psychology or project, and then I can get back to, formation and the arts and literature and all that. So this was the psychology project, and it came out of a 2-hour argument that I had with another PhD student in my living room, and he was basically pushing me on trauma and embodiment, and so went down the rabbit hole and came out with this. But yeah, it was an unexpected path, but it was also a way of reconciling some tensions that had existed for 15 plus years.
Mm-hmm. And so maybe just for listeners' sake, what was your goal in the book? Kind of give us a little bit of the thesis. And now that it's been out for a couple of years, do you think it's working? Do you think you accomplished your goal? Would you change it?
Yeah.
Go back in time?
Yeah, I mean, I've been kind of blown away and really gratified in the strict sense, in the real sense of the term, like grateful for the change that's made. I've had a lot of people reach out to me saying how helpful it's been and healing it's been to have this framework out there. So again, my goals in doing the project were somewhat internal, somewhat like I want to figure this out. Like I want to try and bring these pieces together. But I also, one way I've put it is that I wanted to help pastors not to hurt their weakest members, because what I noticed was there was a dichotomy that existed within the church of like, say something like anxiety. That's what I focused on, where if you're a pastor sitting across from someone, you might be sitting there thinking, is this sin? Like sinful anxiety, like John Piper says, that anxiety is sinful unbelief, or is this something that's going on in the body, right? And so it was almost this posture of like guilty until proven innocent. Like if I get to a certain threshold and this seems sufficiently bad, then I might say, well, you may want to see a medical doctor. And I was like, that just seems totally wrong. And so my project is essentially trying to say, no, that the body-soul relation is holistic. And so it always involves neural pathways and hormones and neurotransmitters and all those things. And so I'm trying to propose a genuinely holistic way of looking at the human person. And that, in my opinion, requires that we expand what we mean by the means of grace, and how we see formation happening in Scripture. So I actually, in my original dissertation, the last paragraph of the dissertation I cut out for the book, but it was essentially trying to bring together two people that I was really influenced by, James K. Smith and Kevin Van Hooser. So. Or another way of putting it is psychology that makes James K. Smith's project work. So I was bothered when he came to TEDS and spoke by how hard he was on theologians. And so I'm like, how do we bring together embodiment and embodied practices and liturgical participation and even the expanded sense of liturgy that all of our life is a living sacrifice. With the idea that actually God's speech matters and what we think matters, and that we think God's thoughts after him matters. So my project was trying to be integrative, the top-down reflective thought, but also the way that we're formed by our experiences. So
very good. Very good. Yeah, no, and that definitely came through. Like I remember early on reading it, and you bring up how when it comes to depression and the pastor's sitting there with someone, there seems to be a readiness with saying, oh, that might be something in the body. You might need to go see a doctor in order to get some medication. But when it's anxiety, there seems to be a hesitation there and what's going on, and certainly I saw that in my own common experience. And has been some more thoughtfulness on it since then. Like we even had Kelly Kapic come to our church and teach on this kind of thing. Just
he's fantastic.
A year or two. Yeah, he's helpful. I saw that like after I invited him, because I was part of the team that organizes who comes to our church to do some conference speaking once a year. And then I saw, oh, he actually endorsed your book. Like I was like, oh, small world.
He was on my hit list of people that like again, I mean, I just basically
Thoughtful
reached out.
theologians.
Yeah, I reached out to people who had a big influence on me, and I was like, kind of like, do you like me? Like, will you accept my gift? So
which is kind of what I feel like I'm getting into right now with the podcasting. It's kind of weird because I like get to just jump ahead and like have conversations with people like you. But going back to the James K. Smith, I want to just go into that a little bit. So his Cultural Liturgies project, he talks about humans as liturgical animals, and he doesn't try to, like, he says that there's a difference between the logical and the bodily or whatever, but he kind of says it's blurred, like that we distinguish it too much. And sometimes it feels like he so focuses on the bodily that he discounts the logic, the speech, the thought. And it feels like you bring that out so much more clearly. So would you say that there's a contrast between your work and his, like, or do they just complement each other?
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly there's a contrast. I'm hesitant to get into a deep critique of James K. Smith since it's been so long since I've read his Cultural Liturgies, but I'll give you my impressions of what I walked away from. So I thought that he was pretty hard on the heresy of paraphrase, like the idea that what Van Hooser would call like direction, like a theologian for Van Hooser is the dramaturge, and local pastors are directors of local dramas, local presentations of the theodrama, right? And I think that direction and doctrine has a place in the life of the church, and I felt like James K. Smith sort of maybe obscured that place, or didn't have a good answer to that question, like what are theologians for, or what are what is the teaching of a pastor for, or something like that. I think that what Van Hooser does really well is he actually takes a doctrine and makes it less sort of detached and abstract information about God, and puts it within the framework of the drama. And that's where they overlap, right? Is that they're both talking about to be an embodied creature is to be a storied creature. That's like a central part about what it means to be human, is that we can tell ourselves a story about ourselves, but then we also are lodged within bigger stories that we're participating in, and the story that we're living in is the drama of Scripture. And so I just thought that it's relatively easy to reconcile them, and whatever critiques I would have of James K. Smith might just be simply that he's not talking about the things that I want him to talk about. But I thought that the issue for me when it comes to Smith and Van Hooser was that you needed a psychology which talked about how our verbal the things that we sort of listen to and hear verbally, but also our sort of self-talk actually then has a shaping effect on the body, and how the experiences of the body sort of work with our words. And so that's really what there's in my psychology that I put out in the model, there's 3 levels. It's actually conscious reflective thought, and then sort of the unconscious automatic perceiving and feeling of our body, and then the way that becomes sort of habituated into, let's call it our bodily climate, like the hormonal and involving the endocrine system and the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And I think that's a psychology that it makes sense of the whole person, and it makes sense of where people get stuck, both in terms of their ideas, but then also just in terms of their bodily habits and certain things that are even inherited, epigenetically. So that's a lot, but
no, it's I think, well, the way that I've been thinking about your work is you talk about those 3 levels, our minds, our middle level that we have some control over, and then the bottom level where we don't have control over. We actually did an episode on Thomistic psychology, like 2 or 3 episodes ago. So listeners can go back to that in order to do a deeper dive on these levels. But I'm curious, I'm thinking about this from a technology perspective. It seems like technology is one of those external things that can cause anxiety. So a teenage girl who's on Instagram or TikTok and is experiencing anxiety, like there is something external, there's also a choice, but it's hard because there's addiction, there's different things that are caught up with that teenage girl who's feeling maybe anxious in the midst of that. So how should we think about that teenage girl struggling with anxiety who's also on social media?
Yeah, and there's also one other context too, which is the relational context, because that even the choice to engage in technology is often arising from a desperate attempt to not be alone, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that. But tell me your question one more time, because I just got sidetracked there.
That's okay. No, it's a really important point. How should we respond to a teenager dealing with anxiety? Do we just blame technology, get rid of the technology? Like that would be one approach, right?
Yeah, I remember my train of thought now. I do think that we are, it's possible that the mental health uptick that we've seen, especially since the late 2000s. Jonathan Haidt has done fantastic work on all this, and I think we have to take his work seriously. But the other voice that I think is important is Anna Lembke with Dopamine Nation, because you have your neurotransmitters, including serotonin and dopamine, are sort of in the same class of neurotransmitters. They're monoamine transmitters. And I think it might be possible that actually what we're calling a sort of mental health crisis is actually just an addiction crisis. It's a serious issue because we're getting so much, so many dopamine feedback loops that it sort of seeks an equilibrium. So like when you get these hits, you're going to end up feeling crummy, and withdrawn when you're not getting the hits. And, I think that it's fundamentally reorganized how we are in the world, how we live in the world, especially in terms of our relationships. So one thing that we can't sort of quantify, which is really hard to get our heads around, is just what our embodied physical presence with other people does for us psychologically, and how our sort of tracking insecurity. When I say tracking, I mean like we're unconsciously tracking our relational safety. So that security or safety that was a lived sense before we went so online, like how has that diminished? I don't think we have studies that show us a reliable way of measuring that then and now. But I do think that we feel a lot more insecure. So this is just anecdotal here, but I think we feel a lot more insecure in our relationships because what you realized, I realized this in the late 2000s. I was an administrator on a forum. It was a theological forum, and it was really interesting because it was a revolving door on the same issues over and over again. And so I just got tired of it and walked away. But it was fascinating how you think you have made relational traction with someone. You're really kind of going back and forth and talking a lot, over 6 months, and then all of a sudden they're just gone. You've done something or said something that they disagree with, and you had built up no trust at all, really, and that is different than the real face-to-face world. And so I think, I don't know, like what do we mean by mental illness? What do we mean by an anxiety disorder? I mean, it's something that's experienced, and it has a common cluster of symptoms, but there's a lot of contextual factors that go into it that we can't get our hands around entirely. But I think that technology has a massive role to play, both in terms of the dopamine, withdrawal that it's producing, but also in terms of the way that it's impacted our lived sense of safety relationally.
Yeah, and you've really kind of dug in onto the science stuff. I think some Christians, it's almost like they're hesitant with that for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And like, I remember it was such a profound moment. Listening to Andy Crouch say something to the effect of, yeah, there's all this negative things that technology is doing, but the science of neuroplasticity shows that you can work your, like, you can get out of it, because the neuroplasticity proves that blah blah blah. And it was like I found myself so appreciating the hope that he was giving through the science. So can you help us understand what is this science of neuroplasticity, and how does that help us understand what goes on when it comes to anxiety or addiction?
So neuroplasticity is just the idea that we can form new neural connections. I think I defined plasticity a little bit differently in my dissertation, where it wasn't just the forming a new connections, but actually when we talk about a new connection, we mean that it's a durable thing, right? So like, you know, I don't know, if you put up a bridge, it's not just that the bridge was there one day, but that it is there now, right? And so so that's the capacity to form new neural connections, but that those neural connections would be durable, is really what I mean by plasticity, neuroplasticity. But so it's good news that we can form new neural connections. It also could be potentially bad news, because you know, depends where the bridge is leading, right? But it's good news in the sense that if we're unhappy with the way that we're formed, there's new ways that we could be formed, right? So it's not you know, it's not just broken, like it's not you know, it's not like there's no possible way of building the bridge. But so when it comes to tech, though, I mean, I think that, yeah, I think that there's hope, but I tend to be a little bit of a Luddite on this, in the sense that I think that there are sort of non-negotiable parts of being human, which involve especially face-to-face interaction and an embodied presence. I mean, we have a men's Bible study, and every week we're there. I try to shake hands with everybody at my table and give people hugs if they need them, and all those things. And those are ways of actually forming people to feel relationally safe within that context, that you can't do online. And so there are, I think, a lot of things that can be done. I mean, we're talking face to face, and I'm seeing you nod, and I'm seeing you smile, and all those. So I'm not saying it's completely hopeless, but I do tend to be a little bit of a localist, in the sense that my primary thing that I'm doing is loving the guys that have names that that I can give hugs where I am. Does that make sense? Because I don't know. It's like there's a line at the end of Candide, Voltaire. He just says, "We must cultivate our garden," and that's how I kind of view pastoring and working in ministry, is taking care of the people who are there, you know, that loving the people who are in front of you in real tangible ways. So I tend not to be real progressive about technology, although I'll grudgingly admit that there are possibilities there. I will sometimes use ChatGPT, even though I didn't for my dissertation. You know, obviously it wasn't invented, but
Totally. No, there's the ongoing tension of this kind of stuff. If Joel were here, he's our super pro technologist. Well, he has his reservations about it as well. If you were here in this conversation, you'd be like, well, just think about the future with like, there's going to be a metaverse, and there's going to be the interactions with goggles, and we're going to feel way more physical with one another than what we can right now. So it won't just be face to face; it'll be more three-dimensional, and it'll fill the room more, in the same way. And it's like, all those things will help increase the sense of presence, but we will still need to eat together.
Well, and it's
intended.
And what I'm interested in is what happens in that moment when you take them off. Like you're living in two alternate realities, and like the moment you take them off, you're like, oh, I'm just here. Like I'm just here alone in this room. Does that make sense? Like, I think that there's something, I don't know, just basic about that, and basic about the way that our embodiment is where we are. Like that is going to always be more persuasive in terms of teaching me what is real and who I am, and so I've gone back and forth a lot on this, and maybe I'll have to listen to your podcast archive to hear Joel. It was Joel you said his arguments, but I just think that like what has been so obvious for so long is all the positive benefits of technology. But I guess I'm influenced by guys like Jacques Ellul in the sense that it is. I get that in order to really make an impact not make an impact, but in order to just be relationally present with people, like we can't just completely check out of what's happening in terms of technology. But the dark side of technology, I think, and especially these sort of communicative technologies and the ways that they enable social feedback and don't strengthen social bonds and create and generate loneliness and addiction. The dark sides are becoming so obvious now. and I think it is time just to ask ourselves, like, what does it mean to be an embodied, socialized human? And I think that at the end of the day, like, there is a skill to navigating a table full of 8 guys. There's a skill to navigating a room full of 30 people. There's a skill that it takes to talk to a crowd of 200 or 2,000. And those are sort of basic human skills that when we walk away from them, we'll always take the goggles off and realize, oh, I'm here. and I don't think it, like, unless we could live in the metaverse permanently, this is, we're going to have to come to terms with what embodied presence is.
Yeah, no, I'm completely with you. One of the things that you bring up, that Jacques Ellul brings up in his book Propaganda. Sorry, there's a loud truck passing my house. Here, like, I'm at a physical embodied place right now.
Yeah, right.
These things around me. But in his Propaganda book, he talks about, I thought it might not be relevant for me, but I knew I should read more Ellul anyways. And so he got to this point, or he has this whole chapter on, like, the human need for propaganda. That there's basically this deep human impulse to have a narrative, to have something to make sense of our world, because man is kind of lonely and insecure, or not just a little, but we really are, all of us struggle with this. And that's why the pandemic was so disruptive to our lives, and why we don't realize the importance of walking down the street and nodding even at someone we recognize and we see them. We really need some of this stuff that helps us make sense of our reality on a level that's not even conscious. This physical life together. And
I've really been interested actually in loneliness studies, because there generally are like 3 levels that you talk about in terms of loneliness. I think it's like intimate, social, and communal. So I think that they provide different things. Like, I think that at an intimate level, there's this sort of mutual vulnerability of being known and accepted at the deepest level. I think at a social level, there's a sort of camaraderie and brotherhood or sisterhood that you can get from, it's a place where you're sharing joys and sufferings, and that's what we mean really when we talk about fellowship. You can't have fellowship with 2,000 people. But then at an upper level, there's this shared narrative, shared sense of purposefulness that you get. And, like, if you're not sort of connected to people at all 3 levels, you do suffer, right? And I think that maybe if you don't have one, you can sort of make up for it by leaning into the others. Like I think that there's a reason why the pandemic caused so much anxiety and angst was because people really doubled down on the sort of ideological cohesion. They wanted to feel a part of something bigger than they were. Does that make sense?
Totally. Where should I read more to understand this loneliness stuff you're talking about?
I think his name is John Cassiopo or something like that. I'll have to send you offline. Maybe I've got his name wrong, but he's kind of one of the big guys in loneliness studies. As a generalist, I dip in here and there to lots of different things. But yeah, that's one guy that I've read a number of things from. So
no, that's super interesting. Two different ways I could keep going with this conversation, but I want to ask this question before I forget to, so I'm going to make sure I ask it. Is you just referenced the generalist aspect. You did a PhD willingly commentating on scripture. You're like, here's how you properly do exegesis of Matthew chapter 6. And when Jesus talks about anxiety, you dealt with that at a biblical level. And some people, they do their whole PhD on just one chapter of the Bible, and they go into the world of biblical studies. You dealt with biblical studies. You also dealt with theology. You also dealt with like historical retrieval stuff. Like you went deep into Calvin and Aquinas and pulled their stuff, contextualized them in light of their own work. And then you also dealt with this modern science and psychology. It seems like that's absolutely necessary to deal with human persons. You have to deal holistically. And yet sometimes the PhD path is not holistic. So how did you wrestle through that? And how did you have the courage to write something that was across so many disciplines?
Yeah, I mean, just you can swipe out courage for stupidity. No, I mean, I mean it that the system is not set up to do this. So the reason why it worked was because Kevin Van Hooser is a flexible mentor. Like I think that most mentors would have said, no, you can't do that. I think that Kevin was like, hey, let's wait and see. Let's see where this goes. I remember when I'm not joking. So I was 200 pages into my dissertation. I had submitted to him the Calvin chapter, and his reply was, I think I get what you're trying to do now. And and I was like, okay. I mean, at least he didn't say, and I hate it, and you should stop doing it, I'll just say, like, I mean it that it was like a home run swing where, there's every chance that I could have just struck out, but it's also, you don't get ahead by doing this because if you want an academic career, what you should do is you should pick something very, very narrow where you are the indisputed expert on this particular topic. And then you can churn out 30, 40 papers on that topic, and nobody's going to stop you because you're the guy who knows. And so they're going to publish the next, minor tweak that you're making to studies of this thing, right? And so if you want a job, that will fill out your CV and you get to be a teacher. So that's, to be a generalist is to sign up for a lot of difficulty because you can't do that. It takes a lot of time and a lot of energy to get your hands around a new area. And I did it because that's what I'm good at. Like, that's how God made me, is that I can come into a new thing and I can get my hands around the essence of it at a fairly quick pace. Right. And so, and like Van Hooser, I'm a sort of guy who's always looking for different connections and trying to, what I'm after is I'm trying to find a reality, and so I'm not a like very rigid sort of, I have to discipline myself to be very disciplined about how I approach scholarship, because I'm constantly trying to look for patterns. And a lot of this has to do with actually Esther Meek and the way that she's influenced me, and Michael Polanyi, the way that he's influenced me. But yeah, so like, I would love it if more PhDs could do the work of a generalist, But to sign up to do that is also to sign up to just a difficult path. Like it's going to be harder to get teaching opportunities, but then when you come to the church, it's also harder to get significant leadership roles there because your PhD changes you in ways that the church doesn't like. It makes it harder to talk to normal people. So you have to have a reintegration phase, which is like 4 or 5 years after doing a PhD for a lot of people. And so, anyway, I would say I had a lot of anxiety, which is why I had 200 pages of history. My second reader, Dr. David Louis, said it's really hard to build a constructive case on a historical, framework, and that's what I did. That's what I tried to do. And I was even walking into my dissertation defense, I was like, we'll see how this goes. And Dr. Louis was really kind to basically read his prepared statement as the second reader right away, which then I was like, okay, I passed. So, but yeah, I mean, so it's challenging. But I think generalism is necessary. It's needed because it serves the church, because you can deal with real questions, and that's why I did it. Was I just wanted to try and figure out how to think about this in a way that was faithful to Scripture, but also was really plugged into the book of nature and got to the reality of who we are as human beings.
Super helpful. Thank you. And also thanks for the warning, because that's kind of what I'm doing. So we'll see. Maybe a year from now, my supervisor will say, time to narrow to just this. But we'll see.
Well, if you go with both eyes open, that's great. I mean, I think that's part of my difficulty, is that I didn't always go with both eyes open,
Yeah, no, I know there's going to be challenges and whatever. I get critiques, life goes on.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't see it as proving myself to the world. I see it as writing something and contributing what I know and
serving.
The best I can do.
An academic ideally serves the church. Yeah.
What role you just talked about your own anxiety there? Even myself, as I'm thinking about all this technology and addiction, I play chess a lot, online chess, and I get into the dopamine cycles of playing 1 minute chess. Even last night, I was thinking about, I could be prepping more for this call on anxiety, but let me just play one more game. And the one more game turned into multiple games. And like, I'm literally like, this is less than 12 hours ago, or I forked whatever it was. So, then you have your own anxiety. So it's like you're going through this thing, writing all of these words, and yet your lived experience is one of embodiment. How was that process for you? Did you feel like sometimes it almost feels like I'm abstracting everything, and even though I want this to be a practical thing that serves the church, I'm getting into like, what's this interpretation? That like I'm getting into so many abstract things. And yet it is so practical what I'm trying to work through. So how'd that go for you?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you this. I was at my peak during PhD work. I was 245 pounds, and I was working in my unfinished basement that was cold. So I had multiple candles on my desk that I literally would sit there and warm my hands over the candles. And but it was a quiet spot. And I would come upstairs, and my wife got so irritated at me coming up the stairs, as she says, as a depressed Matt, that she's like, I'm going to go away for a weekend, and I'm going to figure this out. And when I come back, we're going to talk about it. And so she read a book. She completely transformed our diet. She forced me to work out multiple times a week with a friend, and it totally transformed the trajectory that we were on, because I had to take seriously the fact that we needed constructive and productive habits as family. And so we've been working out cardio and weightlifting for, I don't know, when was that? 2015, maybe 2014. 50 pounds lighter than I was then, and in much better shape and in much better mental health state. But yeah, I mean, those are like I think the thing that I learned during the process, because around the same time I was building a bedroom in our basement, doing a PhD, you don't, nobody gets the ideal situation. You just have to survive, right? And so we built a bedroom in our basement because we needed a renter, and we didn't want the renter to be literally 7 feet away from our, bedroom. And so, but during when I built it, it was such a therapeutic thing to see progress, like as compared to the dissertation. And it also was, I listened to a bunch of Wendell Berry, and what it did for me was it basically put my ambition in perspective, that I was trying to go to a theoretical place and become a theoretical somebody. And that ambition was having real life consequences on my wife and kids, and especially because I was showing up as a depressed person who was, just so earnestly trying to prove that I was okay to everybody. And I had to check my ambition and say, oh no, who am I? I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm going to show up for those things. I'm not going to, just do the one thing that I want to do. I have to live a holistic life. And so that was just absolutely essential. It's what allowed us to survive. Was a sort of gut check on what it means to be human while doing a PhD. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you need to have those formative moments, and maybe within atomistic psychology, there's behind the middle layer, the vegetative, and then there's your wife, who's one with you, and there's an influence there that's really important. I know I could not do nearly anything in my life without the support of my wife, so I totally hear you on that.
Well, and you learn that your limits are a gift. Because I think that you don't see that when you're in the thick of it, but afterward you see, this limit taught me to rest. Like even the last 5 years have been just such a learning experience of just physically opening my hands to God in prayer and saying, not my will, but your will be done. And the limits and the frustrations that I've experienced have taught me to be a person who's okay, like a person who can trust God in the moment and not live in that constant hamster wheel of striving. And so I would say I'm profoundly more happy than I was during my PhD. And a lot of it just had to do with failures and frustrations. I mean, there's a lot more that I could get into, but God has been kind, not just in success. I mean, the success it's been really fun and gratifying, but actually his most profound kindness in the last 7 years have been in the things that I just desperately wished were not part of our lives.
Wow. Well, thanks for sharing all those things. It's easy to talk the talk, but to walk it out is another. And so, this episode is for those who are listening, this has been Matthew LaPine. He wrote a book called The Logic of the Body. The Logic of the Body. We haven't talked that much about the content of the book. It's hard. I couldn't help myself to get into some of this kind of stuff and learn the personal side and kind of hopefully just get some clear direction for myself. So thanks, Matt, for taking the time to meet with me and to share this conversation with our listeners. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew.
All right. Use tech, find rest, glorify God. Thanks for listening, everybody.